Hi, everybody. Today, in our series on early childhood development and getting ready for kindergarten, we're moving on to a session called the knowledge gap. And so we're going to be focusing on the importance of connecting your children to experiences and then also to some content knowledge so that they have a foundation to build their future learning upon. And you, as parents, have a tremendous and very important role in helping your children to connect to these experiences in a number of ways. So our goals for this session are to identify some current trends that have created a knowledge gap for our children. We're going to talk more about what that knowledge gap is. We're going to compare appropriate skill-based and content instruction that should be happening in our schools, but often is lacking, unfortunately, and we need to, as parents, be thinking about ways that we can compensate for that. And then we're going to also define what developmentally appropriate content infused literacy teaching and learning looks like in early childhood. Now, we've touched on that concept before a couple of sessions ago, but we're going to build on that a little bit more and do a little bit of review around that. And ultimately, I have a video that we're going to view of an expert on this concept of the knowledge gap. That'll be really great for us. Just a little bit of review. I've shared this with you before. My thought that learning occurs through this very scientific process of fake it until you make it. I've told you before, children need the opportunity in play-based environments to literally act out and try out the things that they are experiencing in their lives. And as they do that, they are literally building the hard wiring of their brains that's going to support their ability to problem solve, to think, and ultimately to learn as they move forward into kindergarten and the subsequent years of school ahead of them. Everything that any of us has ever learned in our lives, we have had to go through this fake it till you make it process that caused us to be able to own that knowledge. And hello, Angela, thank you for joining us. And so this idea of fake it until you make it is very important in terms of us as parents thinking about opportunities for children to have experiences that then they can go back and act out, play out with various props and that kind of thing. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. But let's look at what's been happening in our schools and how our schools in America specifically have approached early childhood education. Big focus on reading in our schools. And this term reading is a very broad term that is used to encompass not just matching letters to sounds, but also comprehending what our children are reading. And that's a set of skills that can be taught that can be taught disconnected from content. And so we have teachers teaching children different skills like inferring meaning from text, finding the main idea in a particular book that they're reading, things like that. In America through third grade, we have this idea that children need to spend their time learning to read so that at third grade, they can begin this process of reading to learn. And so the idea there is that we give them all those prerequisite skills, kindergarten, well, actually pre-kindergarten through third grade. And then after third grade, they're taking classes in science and social studies and that kind of thing. And they're able to use that newfound ability to read to learn in all of those subject areas. So there's a tremendous amount of focus right now in our schools on the literacy block. And Angela, you've been working in a school, so you've seen that happen, where there's a lot of focus on literacy and learning how to read. In fact, there's such a focus on this in the state of Mississippi that I believe it was in 2013, the legislature passed a law that's commonly known as the third grade reading gate that says that if your child's not reading on level and pass this test in third grade, that they'll actually be held back at that point. So big focus on reading. And we've been talking about a lot of the things that you as parents can be doing to help make sure your children reach that point where they are able to read for learn after third grade. But we're going to talk in a minute about some issues with that idea too that we need to make some adjustments about. Because one of the other things that we have in our American approach is this idea that because literacy is so important, science and social studies learning can wait, right? So we don't have a lot of time for that kind of thing in the early grades because we're spending so much time on ELA, a little bit of time on math, and there's really not a lot of time for these other subjects. And so what we're saying in America is the focus must be on reading skills that are going to equip children to acquire that knowledge later. So this idea that reading has been dominant is not a new thing. It's been happening. And hi, Patty, thank you for joining us. In 1977, early elementary teachers were telling us that they were spending more than twice as much time on reading as they were on science and social studies combined. And the really kind of interesting thing about this is back in the 50s, when this whole education kind of revolution began, it started when the Soviets sent a satellite into space called Sputnik. And at that point, a lot of people in the United States became very concerned about this idea that America was losing its edge and that so many other countries were doing better than us in education. And so the idea was that we needed to be innovative, that we needed to produce these people that would be literally rocket scientists and that kind of thing. And so what do we need to do about our schools? And they centered in on this idea that you got to be literate in order to learn those higher level math and science skills. And so all of this focus on reading started to dominate what was happening in the school. And if you think about it, that's kind of counterintuitive. If we want to stand out in the world, we need people that are creative. We need people that know the science and all this kind of stuff. And yet science and social studies has been pushed to the side because we started with what we saw as foundational, which was the literacy component. In 2001, the No Child Left Behind law required annual reading and math tests in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. And so that began this super focus on high stakes testing in our schools. And we see teachers spending a lot of time preparing students to be successful on those tests at the end of the year because those tests drive a lot of consequences that could potentially happen to schools and to teachers if the students don't do well. And in 2012, teachers are reporting at that time that they're spending an average of about 16 minutes a day on social studies and only 19 minutes a day on science. And again, that literacy block had expanded between 90 minutes to 3 hours. And the focus again was passing those standardized tests that all the students needed to do. So up to a quarter of the school year now is spent preparing for tests, or taking benchmark tests. And guys, assessment's not a bad thing. We really do need to be using data to inform our instruction and that kind of thing, but it really has kind of gotten out of hand. And in fact, Arne Duncan, the Secretary of Education in the Obama administration, at the end of his tenure admitted that testing had in fact gotten out of hand. In 2015, Congress replaced No Child Left Behind with the Every Student Succeeds Act. And the focus there was to try to reduce the consequences of those annual test scores. But ultimately, as states began making modifications for No Child Left Behind, it really didn't start looking very much differently than it did under No Child Left Behind. So there was no reduction in testing. So the results for more than 20 years, about 2/3 of our students consistently score below the proficient level. Even though we're spending all this time focusing on all this testing and this literacy, we're still not seeing huge gains in ability. Only 18% of 8th graders scored proficient. In U.S. history, 23% in civics and 27% in geography. And guys, those are abysmal numbers, but it's because our students in the lower grades are just not spending a lot of time with social studies content. And this idea that we can wait until 3rd grade to start using reading ability to teach these things has not proven to really work. There's no proof in the pudding of that. In fact, we're seeing students doing very poorly in using that reading ability for learning in social studies because they don't have any prior knowledge to build that social studies learning upon. The 2014 study showed that students on one college campus didn't know who won the Civil War, who the vice president was, or what country the U.S. won independence from. All things that, 20, 30 years ago, students were learning in some of the earlier grades. Many adults are unable to determine between reliable and unreliable online sources, creating a threat to democracy. And guys, we saw that recently in the raid of the Capitol that happened in January. People were reading things on the internet and taking them to heart in spite of the fact that they were not necessarily true and behaving in very extreme ways based off of that information, because they were not able to determine between a reliable and an unreliable online source. So there's this universal approach with skills-based instruction in our school, focusing on comprehension skills, things like inferring meaning, finding the main point, all that kind of thing. A 2007 study found that half of children in schools serving middle class or above were subjected to repetitive instruction and in basic skills. And this jumps to 91% when we go to our lower socioeconomic schools. Just a lot of focus on repetitive drills, getting ready for those high stakes tests. When schools are under pressure to raise test scores, administrators and teachers maximize time on reading and math, and often at the expense of the other content areas. So when students are learning how to read, they're going through this systems of strategic action. And I'm going to read this quote to you. Reading is thinking. Reading involves doing a great many complicated things at the same time. And for most children beyond grade 1, it all happens silently in the head. We can't see or hear the thinking taking place, but we know it is going on because the individual is reading the words and understanding the meaning. Now, guys, there's a lot going on in this system of strategic action, and there's really small print on this graphic. And the good news is you don't have to read all that small print because all these things are going to happen automatically as children learn to read. And the three major systems is that they're thinking within the text, they're looking at the pictures, they're hearing the words, they're thinking about constructing meaning based off of that. They're thinking beyond the text. And that means that they are thinking about connections to other things they may have experienced based off of what they are reading. And then they're also thinking about the text. And so they're basically trying to decide, do I like this? Am I really understanding what it means and all of those kinds of things? But again, these systems are happening simultaneously. And I want to point out to you this idea of thinking beyond the text and making connection to previous experiences is the foundation for a lot of this knowledge gap that we're talking about, because students that have not had a lot of experiences, students that have not been exposed to math, science, and social studies content in a real systematic way, they're not able to make those connections. We're going to get into this in our next session. We're going to look at this simple view of reading. But basically what we know is that reading is this process of decoding and linguistic comprehension that results in reading comprehension. And the issue is if you're missing either of these first two, either the decoding or the linguistic comprehension, then you are going to not be able to comprehend what you're reading. And unfortunately, even though some of our students learn how to decode words, if they don't have an understanding of the meaning of those words, if they're not able to connect that back to previous experiences and other books that they've read and that kind of thing, then they're not going to get to this point of reading comprehension. This is another way to think about how skilled reading happens. This is called Scarborough's rote model, and we'll talk more in depth about it next session. But there's all these strands that weave together to produce skilled reading. And two major categories of that are language comprehension And you'll see that key aspect of that at the very top, that background knowledge that includes facts and concepts and other things like that, is key to that language comprehension component. And then you also have the word recognition part where you're able to recognize the sounds of words, you're able to decode the letters and have that understanding of the connection of those sounds to those letters. And then for some words, we're simply able to just recognize the word as we see it. But all of this weaves together, increasingly strategic and increasingly automatic to produce a skilled reader. So the knowledge gap. Test scores for low-income and minority students are consistently far below their more affluent peers. Some other terms that have been used for this knowledge gap are the achievement gap, but other people call it the test score gap. But really, guys, it's an opportunity gap. Children that come from less affluent environments have had less opportunity for the kinds of experiences that more affluent students have. You could look at a study that happened many, many years ago where they looked at where television went into certain parts of the country before other parts of the country. And they did this study and they found places where television became available 10 years before other places that the students perform better in school. So on the surface, you could say, well, having a TV makes you more successful in school. But they dug into that data a little bit more deeply, and they found that the places that got television first were typically the places that had the more affluent families and had, therefore, this access to this television. And so it wasn't the television that was producing the gains in school. What it was the experience of living in that affluent environment. So you could also say riding to school in a Mercedes, makes you do better in school than riding the school bus. But really, it's all that comes with riding to school in that Mercedes, being able to go on trips, being able to have all these experiences, having parents that typically have a broader vocabulary that they're using around their children. So if we have children that are falling into this opportunity gap, then what we need to be doing is focusing on providing as many opportunities as possible. One great source of those opportunities is through literacy, literally by reading. When I was young, my parents were teenage parents. When my dad had just turned 20 years old, and they, were not well-to-do, but what they did do is they read to me a lot. And so that's one way. Other way that we can fill in this opportunity gap is connecting students with experiences. We're going to talk more about that. But studies suggest that students with low test scores are less likely to pursue higher education, keep jobs, provide for their families, exercise their civic responsibilities, and live fulfilling lives. So it's important that we close this opportunity gap. So what if it turns out that the best way to boost reading scores is not to focus on comprehension skills at all, but to teach kids as early as possible the social studies and science we've been putting off until it's too late? And guys, that's really the answer to this. We cannot wait to teach science and social studies until 4th grade. We need to be giving our students content knowledge. And guys, for preschoolers, that's doing things like going to the Children's Museum and having experiences. It's going to a quality preschool program and having experiences. It's playing with them at home. It's talking to them about things that they're doing. And as I've said before, it's also reading lots and lots of books to them so that they're learning about some social studies and science concepts, so that when they get to school and begin learning those things, they have prior knowledge to build that new knowledge upon. Talked about the pendulum swing in education. We've had this major shift away from content-based instruction in the early grades. We as parents need to be aware of that and make sure that we're connecting our children to some rich experiences related to science and social studies. And guys, for your young children, social studies is getting along with one another. It's getting into a play group and learning how to get along. It's controlling strong emotions. It's learning about the community, learning about their world, beginning to learn some facts, and that kind of thing. We talked about this before, developmentally appropriate environments. Children are encouraged to talk, observe, wonder, and explore. That's how we have those experiences. Children are invited to have those authentic, meaningful experiences with literacy, where they're sitting in our lap, where we're doing that interactive reading with them. They're having regular opportunities to express their ideas in writing, either through drawing or writing. Abundant place opportunities, and they're also getting clear instruction in literacy. We've talked about this developmentally inappropriate approach where play is limited, repetitive drills, and all that kind of thing. We've got to compensate for these inappropriate experiences that our children may be having. So we know that reading aloud to students is not a luxury, but a necessity. We consider reading aloud to be an essential foundation of a good language and literacy program. Reading aloud supports learning in every other language. It's a way of nourishing the intellect of your students, expanding background, vocabulary, and language, developing an appreciation for inquiry, and creating a literary community. Guys, if we don't have the resources to get our kids to the Children's Museum and to take them on trips and help them to have experiences, we can do a lot of compensating for that if we'll just do a lot of reading aloud to them. We've talked before about using this interactive read aloud to support our emergent readers, engaging them in those literacy behaviors, and reading aloud is a great way to go about this in terms of helping them to understand the purposes and benefits of reading and expanding their vocabulary, helping them to understand sentence structure, and again, increasing that background knowledge. We talked before also how reading and writing are reciprocal processes that work together. Learning in one supports learning in the other. So we need to be as well doing some writing with our children. And that starts out with them dictating to you and you writing it down. And then it merges as you share the pen and they're able to, for example, know how to write the letter that starts their first name or write their entire name. And then it builds and builds and builds. And so basically, it's this gradual release of responsibility. This graphic says teacher responsibility. It really is focusing on teaching, but we can apply this to the way that we interact with our children as parents. We start out with us doing it. When our kids can't read, we've got to do the read alouds because they can't read. Then that merges through this interactive process where you're doing it together. When my daughter Julia and I would read Redfish, One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish, she began to be able to pick out certain words that she was able to read. Then we let the children play and interact with other children, and they do and act out that fake it till you make it process of reading, and then ultimately they're going to be able to do it alone. Millions of children across the country are waiting for someone to actually teach them something in order to unlock their potential. And what we want to do, guys, is to start early. And so what we know is it's these experiences that close the knowledge gap. I mentioned earlier about taking your children to the new Children's Museum here in Meridian. What a tremendous resource. We also have children's shows that happen at the Riley Center. We have the Mississippi Arts and Entertainment Experience. We have parks. We have other places that you can take your children or just, an hour or so down the road. National parks, different things. Getting your children connected to many real world experiences as possible, and then also connecting them to experiences through reading aloud to them is the way that we connect to the power of background knowledge. And so I mentioned before, we're going to look at a video from a literacy expert. This is Natalie Wexler, and she wrote a book called The Knowledge Gap that I pulled a lot of this information from. And so we're going to end the rest of our time by listening to her talk about this opportunity gap. Hold on, guys. Let me get my video up here.
Hi, my name is Natalie Wexler, and I'm the author of a book called The Knowledge Gap, The Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It. And I'm also the co-author of a book called The Writing Revolution. And I'm an education writer. I write for Forbes.com on education, and I've written for a number of other publications. But I'm here today to talk about the knowledge gap. So about 10 years ago now, I got very interested in education and started looking into especially what we generally call the achievement gap, the gap in test scores between kids at the top and bottom of the socioeconomic spectrum. This seemed incredibly important as a way of bringing more justice and equity to our society, to figure out how to narrow that gap. And when I started looking into this, I was told, and what it seemed to me to be the case, was that the real problem was high school. That's where the scores are lowest, the gap between haves and have-nots is the widest and the most stubborn. And the kids are often somewhat disengaged, and it seems that that's where everything falls apart. That's where the problem is. But what I stumbled across in writing about this and doing some research was that there's another part of our education system that I had been told was the bright spot, elementary school, where the scores were slowly rising, the gap was slowly narrowing, it seemed, and the kids seemed much more engaged and, eager. But what I discovered was that the problems that become so apparent in high school don't begin in high school, and a lot of them really have their roots in how we teach elementary school. So what do I mean by that? Well, basically what I'm talking about is how we approach reading. Just to lay out the landscape here, there are two basic components of reading. There's decoding, sounding out words, which should be taught as a set of skills, foundational skills like phonemic awareness, hearing sounds in words, and phonics, connecting those sounds to letters, fluency, being able to read at an appropriate pace with appropriate expression. And we do have quite a few problems in many schools in this country with how decoding is taught. It's often not taught explicitly as a set of these skills. But I'm not going to talk about those problems. I'm going to focus on the other aspect of reading, comprehension. Obviously, you need both. You need to be able to sound out words, and you need to be able to understand what you're reading to become a good reader. And I would argue that the problems with the way we teach comprehension are probably more widespread and better hidden than the problems with the way we teach decoding. So how do we generally go about teaching reading comprehension? Well, the standard approach is to teach reading comprehension as a set of skills and strategies. I won't go into the distinction between skills and strategies. I think a lot of educators use them interchangeably, but they're things like identifying the main idea in details, determining the author's purpose, making inferences, asking questions. And often there will be a skill of the week that a teacher will demonstrate, model for the class. And the other part of this approach is that students will have been tested to determine their individual reading levels. And those could be useful over their grade levels. What they're directed to do is to practice the skill of the week or the strategy of the week on books that are at their level. In other words, easy enough for them to read independently. And the idea is that if they practice those skills diligently, if they become good at finding the main idea, they will move up this ladder of text complexity. If they're reading below grade level, they'll catch up to where they need to be. And also that they'll be able to apply those skills to, say, find the main idea of any text that's put in front of them, whether it's a passage on a reading comprehension test at the end of the year or a textbook in high school. Let's test out that theory. I'm just going to show you a paragraph from a newspaper, and I'm going to ask you to find the main idea, and I'm sure you're expert readers, so it shouldn't be a heavy lift. Let's take a look at it. You may understand the individual words in this passage, but they may not be adding up. It may be pretty difficult to find the main idea here. I mean, you may know what adjudged means and what leg means and what before means, but what does it mean to be adjudged leg before? So this is a phenomenon that cognitive scientists have known about for quite a while now. And basically, the idea here is that if you don't have background knowledge about what you're reading about, it can be very difficult to find the main idea. I forgot to mention that this paragraph was taken from a British newspaper. And if you're a cricket fan, you'll have no trouble understanding what it's describing, which is a cricket match. But if you don't know much about cricket, this is pretty impenetrable. And I don't know much about cricket. I'm not sure what this is trying to tell me. So as I mentioned, cognitive scientists have known about this for a while. Back in the late 1980s, there was a landmark study that was done. And the researchers really wanted to know what is more important in reading comprehension. Is it general reading of comprehension ability? Or is it really more knowledge of the topic? And they chose the topic of baseball because they figured there are a lot of kids out there who know a lot about baseball, but they aren't generally good readers. They took a bunch of 7th and 8th graders and they divided them up into 4 groups according to how well they scored on the standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave them a passage describing a baseball game and tested their comprehension. And what they found was that the kids who knew about baseball, who were kind of baseball experts, they all did quite well on this comprehension test when the topic was baseball. And the other kids who didn't know about baseball did not do well, regardless of how well they scored on that standardized reading test. So, for example, if you look at those middle 2 bars, the one on the left, those are the kids who were supposedly poor readers but knew a lot about baseball. And to their right, that blue bar is the kids who were supposedly good readers but didn't know about baseball. And as you can see, the kids who were supposedly poor readers did a lot better when the topic was baseball. This is a study that's been replicated many times now, and it's pretty well accepted. What's really important in reading comprehension, not the only factor, but the prime factor, is how much you know about the topic. And this may seem kind of obvious when it's something that calls for somewhat specialized knowledge, like baseball or cricket, or molecular biology. If you don't know much about that and you try to read the abstract of a scholarly article on that topic, it's going to be tough going. I think what is less obvious to many of us is how much background knowledge we all draw on as educated adults to make sense of almost anything we read in newspaper, magazine articles. And so I'm going to show you a paragraph taken from another newspaper story, not about cricket. But this time I'd like you to read through it and think about how much background knowledge you're drawing on to understand what you're reading. I'm assuming that you're able to follow this, but what I notice when I read through this is that it assumes that the reader is going to know things like what an appeal is, what the Supreme Court is, what a federal appeals court is, what a grand jury is, what a subpoena is, what a district attorney is. So a lot of knowledge about the legal system it's not explained here, it's just assumed. And this isn't written for people who've been to law school. This is written for general readers. And if you do know what all those things are, then you have no trouble understanding this paragraph. But if you don't know a lot of those words, then it's going to be tough going, just like that cricket paragraph was. What does this have to do with testing? Well, the passages on standardized reading comprehension tests, like any written passages, leave a lot of information out. They assume that the reader knows certain information. Authors do that because to explain every term that they use would make the writing very tedious. But reading comprehension tests are not tied to specific topics that kids have learned in school. In fact, they're designed not to be tied to those topics because the idea is we want to test comprehension skills. So the topics are kind of random. And if you have the knowledge to to understand the passage, then you can demonstrate your skills. But if you don't have that knowledge, if the passage is impenetrable to you, then you don't get an opportunity to demonstrate your skills. So let's take a look at a released item from a third grade reading comprehension test, and let's see how much knowledge is assumed there. For us as educated adults, this passage may look pretty straightforward. But now let's take a look at this same passage with words and phrases blacked out that a lot of third graders probably won't know. When you're missing that much information, then it really becomes as impenetrable as that cricket paragraph. It's going to be very hard to answer questions about this paragraph because you're missing so much information. Now, of course, some third graders will know these words or many of these words and concepts. And those tend to be the third graders who've been able to pick up that information outside of school, the ones with more highly educated parents, who in our society tend to be the parents with more income. But the other kids are relying on school for that kind of information, for that kind of vocabulary. And they, unfortunately, in our current system, are often the least likely to get that kind of information from school. Because in the last 20 years or so, as reading and math tests have become so important, the curriculum, which was always dominated in the elementary years by reading and math, has become even more dominated by those tested subjects. And so social studies and the arts, and to some extent science, have really been eliminated or at least marginalized from the curriculum in the elementary grades and often even in middle school. And that's especially true in schools where test scores are low because you want to spend more time equipping kids for those tests. But the irony or the tragedy really is that those subjects that have been eliminated, social studies, the arts, science, those are the subjects that really could convey the knowledge and vocabulary that would boost students' reading comprehension and ultimately their test scores. So in an effort to boost test scores, we've really kind of been shooting ourselves in the foot here and undermining our own efforts. So that explains, to a large extent, this gap in test scores between haves and have-nots. What about high school? What does all this have to do with high school? Well, having knowledge doesn't just help you understand what you're reading about, it also helps you absorb and retain new information. So if you already know about baseball and you read an article about baseball, you're more likely not only to understand it, but to remember the new stuff that was in there about baseball. So it's been said that knowledge is like Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. So what this means is that the kids who start out with more knowledge and vocabulary, probably because they've been able to pick it up outside school, especially in our leveled reading system, they're able to read more sophisticated books with more sophisticated vocabulary, and they're also able to retain more new knowledge and vocabulary from those books, and that in turn equips them to read yet more complex books. And so it's a kind of virtuous snowballing cycle. But the other kids in our system are limited to simpler texts with simpler vocabulary, and even with those texts, they're less likely to have that other half of the Velcro that will enable them to absorb and retain new information. And so what happens is they fall farther and farther behind every year as compared to their more advantaged peers. This has been called the Matthew effect in reading, and that's a reference to the Gospel of St. Matthew, and especially to the part of it that translates to the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. What it means is that as time goes on, that gap between good readers and poor readers gets wider and harder to narrow. And that's why it's so important to begin in the elementary years, building knowledge for all kids, and especially for kids who are not as likely to pick up academic kinds of knowledge and vocabulary outside school. If you wait until high school, it's going to be very hard to do much about that gap. And what happens, as I mentioned, is kids can get through middle school without really having had systematic exposure to history, geography, science, anything but reading and math. And so that leads to another kind of gap. And that's the difference between what we assume high school students know and what they do know. I've talked to a lot of teachers, especially in high poverty high schools, and I've volunteered in some. And while teachers have told me they've had students at all levels of ability, they've also told me it's not uncommon to get students in high school who don't yet know the difference between a city and a state, or a country and a continent, who can't find the United States on the map of the world, who can't find their hometown on the map of the United States, and who also don't have a sense of historical chronology. They have trouble, they may think that Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass were friends. It's not because they can't learn these things. It's because no one has taught them these things. And it's very hard to make up for all that lost time in high school. And if you get to high school and you're expected to read a textbook on world history, but you don't have that sense of historical chronology, you don't know what Europe is, you're unsure about so many things that a book like this will assume you know. This is going to be very frustrating for you as a student and also for your teacher. When I stumbled upon this problem, and I realized, even though I thought I knew a lot about education, I'd been writing about it as a journalist for a while, and I'd never heard anyone talk about this problem that was going on in elementary school, that really was underlying so many of the other problems our schools are trying to address. And I realized that somebody needed to maybe write a book about this that would get it into the public conversation. And that is what I tried to do in The Knowledge Gap. But I didn't want just to describe this problem. I also wanted to talk about what can we do about it. And the good news is that there is a lot that schools can do to narrow this gap, rather than to allow it to get wider every year, which is what is happening in our schools right now. What can schools do? Well, the first step is to adopt a different kind of elementary literacy curriculum. It used to be that the only kind of elementary literacy curriculum that you could get was one that was focused on comprehension skills, skill of the week. In the last 6 years or so, there have been several new literacy curricula for the elementary grades that have been developed. These are a few of them. There are probably some more out there now. But these are the ones that I'm somewhat familiar with. They're all different. They cover different bodies of knowledge in different ways. But they have two important defining characteristics that they share. One is that they are organized by topics in history, science, the arts, literature, rather than by skills. And they spend at least a couple of weeks on a particular topic. So not clouds one day and zebras the next, because really what we're learning is how to find the main idea. But we're going to read about, hear about this particular topic for a couple of weeks now. And that gives students the opportunity to absorb and retain new information and the vocabulary that goes with it. The other characteristic that they all have is that they have teachers reading aloud to students, to the entire class, from texts that are too difficult for those students, especially at the elementary level, to read themselves. And that's really important for a couple of reasons. One is that written language is almost always more complex than spoken language. It has its own syntax and vocabulary. And if students are going to understand written language when they are reading it themselves independently, they need to have had an opportunity to hear that language, to get used to it. The other related thing is that students' listening comprehension exceeds their reading comprehension, not just in the elementary grades, but on average through middle school. And that means that they can absorb more complex concepts and vocabulary through listening, and discussion is also important, than through their own reading. And that's really important to build their knowledge, so that when it comes time for them to read about ancient China or whatever, that they will be familiar with the concepts and vocabulary. It will make it a lot easier for them to read independently. One of the things I did for the book was to follow a couple of elementary classrooms, early elementary classrooms, to make this more concrete for myself and for the reader. What does this really look like? And so One followed one classroom that was doing the usual skills-focused approach to reading comprehension using a Basel ruler, and the other that was using one of those new content-focused elementary literacy curricula that was building kids' knowledge. I wish I could show you videos of these two classrooms. I can't do that, but I do have posters that will give you an idea of the differences between these two classrooms. And I should mention that although the classrooms were not identical, one was first grade, one was second grade, no two classrooms are going to be identical, they were pretty similar in many ways. All of the students were from low-income families in both classrooms. They were all children of color. And the teachers in both classrooms were hardworking, dedicated, smart teachers. But the classrooms were like night and day. And the real difference, the reason they were so different, was the curriculum, what was being taught. In the skills-focused classroom, there were some posters on the walls, but they were all about skills. The discussions, such as they were supposed to be all about skills. But it was very hard to get a discussion going because these first graders were really not that interested in talking about main idea or the difference between a caption and a subtitle, which was the focus of one lesson. They just didn't care. It was really kind of abstract, and the teacher would kind of struggle to get a discussion going. In the content-focused classroom, on the other hand, there were lots of really interesting discussions about the content that they were learning about, and there were lots of posters all over the room, like this one, focusing on content, focusing on things like, this is from the unit they did on Greek myths, which the kids loved. This I chose more or less at random, happens to be about the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. And these posters would be created collaboratively by the teacher and the students during and after the day's read aloud. So this was done during and after the read aloud of the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. And there are a couple of things I'd like to point out about this poster. One is the vocabulary. You can see at the top the vocabulary words were desperately, plummeted, foresight. Those were the words that were being focused on. Now, those are pretty sophisticated words for any second graders, but most of the kids in this class were actually from non-English speaking families, and some of them were still learning English themselves. And yet they were using words like this in their conversation. I had lunch with some of them about 3/4 of the way through the school year, and they were using words like revenge and opponent and labyrinth. They were retaining those words because they were getting them in an engaging context, and they were using them in class discussion. And those words will stand them in very good stead in high school and beyond. The other thing I'd like to point out here is that there are things that might look like the teacher is focusing on skills. There's a question of asking students to predict what is Daedalus's plan. There are things that say cause and effect. But the teacher was not trying to teach the skill of making predictions or the skill of determining cause and effect. She was bringing those things in as a way of getting kids to really think about the content. And so it's not like you can never ask kids to find the main idea. It's a question of what you put in the foreground. And if you put content in the foreground, then kids will develop those skills pretty naturally if you ask them those kinds of questions. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that if you don't start building kids' knowledge in elementary school, that all is lost. High school is not too late to build knowledge. It's just more difficult because the gaps, as I mentioned, are so much larger, and the expectations of what students already know are so much higher. But there are things you can do to compensate for those gaps. And from what I've seen, the most promising thing is to teach kids to write about what they're learning. Writing is potentially such a powerful lever for building knowledge that it can compensate for that missing Velcro that students may not have. Let's take a minute to talk about why is that? Why do I say that writing is such a powerful way to build knowledge? Well, scientists haven't really studied writing that much, but they have studied a couple of other things that enter into the writing process. One of those is what's known as retrieval practice, or sometimes called the testing effect. It's been studied mostly in the context of quizzes or testing. But what it boils down to is that if you try to recall information you've slightly forgotten, that's a very powerful boost to retaining that information. It gets lodged in your long-term memory. The second thing that psychologists, cognitive scientists have found is something called the protege effect. And what that boils down to is that when you explain something to another person in your own words, that boosts both your own comprehension, because you can't explain it unless you figure out what it means, and your retention of information. And both of these effects enter into writing. That's what we do when we write, unless we're just copying something that's in front of us. We're both recalling information we've slightly forgotten, and we're putting it into our own words. We're explaining it to somebody. We don't know who, the unknown reader, but another person. So that's why writing can be so powerful. But there is a caveat here, and that is that writing is one of the most, maybe the most difficult thing we ask kids to do in school. It's much more difficult than reading, which we know is pretty tough. And the reason it's so difficult has to do with what psychologists call working memory. Working memory is basically like short-term memory or consciousness. And the important thing to remember or to know about working memory is that it can only hold a limited number of things for a limited period of time. And when you're an inexperienced writer, you're juggling all sorts of things. You may be juggling, if you're young, letter formation. You're juggling spelling. How do I spell that word? What word to choose? How to organize your thoughts? All sorts of things, plus whatever content it is you're trying to write about. If we just ask students to write at length, that imposes a huge demand on their working memory, and they don't have the cognitive capacity available to either learn how to write well or to derive those knowledge building benefits from writing, because they don't have the capacity to really think about what they're writing about. So what can we do about this? Two things. In order to build the kind of knowledge we want kids to get, we need to ground all the writing activity they're doing, or as much of it as possible, in the content that we want them to learn, the content of the curriculum. But secondly, we have to make it not an overwhelming task. We have to make it manageable by modulating that load that writing imposes on working memory. And the best way to do that is to have students start writing at the sentence level, rather than asking them to write at length. So there's a method that I'm familiar with that combines both of those things. It's the only method I know of that combines both of those things, and it's called The Writing Revolution. It's the title of a book I've co-authored with a veteran educator named Judith Hochman, who developed this method over a period of many years. It does start at the sentence. It doesn't end at the sentence level. It goes all the way through argumentative essays, but it does start there. And no matter what the grade level is, if students have not yet learned to write a good sentence, that's where instruction needs to begin. Because if you can't write a good sentence, you're never going to write a good paragraph, you're never going to write a good essay. And also, if you want kids to gain knowledge through their writing, even high school students can be very inexperienced writers, and so they need to learn how to write sentences first. It doesn't mean, that it's going to be a babyish activity. I think there is an assumption out there that writing sentences is just for kids in elementary school, but writing a sentence can be a very difficult exercise. It all depends on the content that you're dealing with. One of the activities in the Writing Revolution method is called because, but, and so. And by the way, this is a method that can be adapted to any subject matter as well as any grade level. It's not just for English class or the ELA block. So let's say you're a social studies teacher or a history teacher and you're teaching about the presidency of Andrew Jackson. You could give your students sentence stems to finish that use these three conjunctions. So Andrew Jackson was a popular president because, but, and so. Now, each of these sentences requires students to think about information that's slightly forgotten about the presidency of Andrew Jackson in a different way and put it into their own words. And but is going to be a little more difficult than because it asks for a contrasting piece of information. This also gives students practice in using these conjunctions, which not all students really just know how to do. And there are different ways that students could finish these, but here are some examples. Because he was the champion of the common man, but there were many critics of his kitchen cabinet and spoil system, So he easily won re-election in 1832. So that, I hope, gives you an idea of the connections between writing and building knowledge and how sentences can help with that. But in order to use this approach to build knowledge, you actually need content in the curriculum. And in many elementary school classrooms, as we know, there just isn't much content. There may not be enough content to enable students to write coherent sentences about anything but their own experience. So the first thing to do is to adopt, if you do not already have a content-rich elementary curriculum, to adopt one. And those sentence level activities can be used very effectively at the elementary level. It's not going to be enough because, especially for elementary teachers, this approach, this new kind of curriculum is going to be really unfamiliar, and they may need some support and some help in implementing it well and understanding what it's all about. But it is the first step, and it's a necessary first step. And you know, curriculum itself is hugely powerful. We hear a lot about the importance of having high expectations for all students, and that really is important. But I've met a lot of teachers who do have high expectations. What they haven't had are the materials that will enable their students to meet those high expectations. But with the right materials, students can not only meet high expectations, but even exceed them. And I will just end with an anecdote that I heard when I was researching the knowledge gap that brought that home to me. It had to do with a second grade teacher whose school had recently adopted one of these new knowledge building curricula. And she was a little skeptical. But she was giving one of her second graders a test to determine his individual reading level. And he was really a struggling reader. He was at the very low end of second grade, and this was well into the school year. And she saw in the testing kit that she had been given that there was a text on the topic of westward expansion. It just so happened that that was the topic that the class had spent 2 weeks on as part of this new curriculum. But the text on westward expansion was at a 4th grade reading level, and this was a struggling second grader. But just out of curiosity, the teacher handed the boy the text, and he read it with 98% accuracy and 100% comprehension. And so the teacher thought, well, maybe there is something to this new curriculum. But also, as I said, I think another thing that happened was the teacher saw that little boy differently and what he was capable of. And I think that little boy saw himself differently too. And one of the reasons that I feel so much urgency about this topic is that there are untold numbers of kids out there who've been told, just practice your comprehension skills and strategies and you will become a better reader and a better student. And there is really no evidence that that works. But for a kid who's been told that it doesn't work, that child may feel that he's got no one to blame but himself, and that he's in, quote unquote, the dumb reading group. And there's really no reason for that. We need to prevent that from happening to so many kids. There's untold potential out there that is going to waste. We need to start unlocking that potential for teachers and for students as soon as we can. So thanks very much for listening.
All right, guys. So to wrap everything up, I know that she talked a lot about the context of working in a school. You as parents can be advocates for that content-rich curriculum when your children get to school. I put this in the wrong view. Let me close that. Here we go. But also, you see here, it's not so much about knowing perfectly how to teach literacy or comprehension skills that's important. It's connecting your child to content knowledge. And that content knowledge, in your case, comes from spending time, having experiences, again, going out into the community and meeting people, talking about things, going to the library, getting books, doing the read alouds, and not just sticking to the storybooks, but also pulling out some of the nonfiction books and reading about different people and places and things and history and science and those types of things. And that's going to give your children an advantage as they go into school, because they will not be experiencing that opportunity gap because they've had the opportunities that they needed to build that background knowledge. So to wrap up, I just want you to think about 3 things that were new to you or that confirmed your thinking. I want you to think about 2 things that you might do, this is with your classroom in your home as a result of this session, and then 1 question that you have after participating. I'll post this recording on our site that we've created. Next time we come together, we'll be focusing on the science of reading, and that's where we'll drill down into beyond just these literacy behaviors and experiences that are so very important, drilling down into that Scarborough rope that we talked about before, of all those components that weave together for your child to be able to decode print, understand the meaning of that, and become a fluent reader by the end of 3rd grade. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.